Welcome back. A few days ago, reporting from the Washington Post revealed something that immediately set off alarm bells across the political world. According to that reporting, a draft executive order has reportedly been circulating inside the White House. The document proposes declaring a national emergency that could potentially allow President Donald Trump to assert sweeping federal control over the upcoming midterm elections. Now, that idea immediately raises an enormous constitutional question. Because elections in the United States are not run by the president, they are administered primarily by the states, with limited oversight roles for Congress. The Constitution is very explicit about that structure. Yet the draft order reportedly frames the issue differently. It suggests that foreign interference, specifically interference by countries such as China, could justify declaring an emergency. That emergency would allow the federal government to intervene directly in election administration. That possibility has triggered a fierce debate. A fierce debate about the limits of presidential power. If attempted, it could create one of the most serious constitutional crises in modern American history. The alleged emergency justification. The idea behind the proposed order centers on claims that foreign governments are attempting to interfere in U.S. elections. In the draft language reportedly obtained by journalists, the order states that there is clear and compelling evidence that foreign interference efforts have intensified. The document argues that this activity constitutes an extraordinary threat to U.S. national security and foreign policy, which would justify invoking emergency powers. Declaring national emergencies is not unusual for presidents. Over the decades, they have used that authority to respond to financial crises and security threats. But critics argue that this situation would be fundamentally different. Because the emergency would not simply address a threat, it would dramatically change who controls American elections. And that is where the constitutional controversy begins. What the executive order could do. According to reporting, the order could assert federal authority. Possible measures discussed include seizing control of voting machines, banning widespread mail-in voting, mandating federal voter identification requirements, restricting the types of identification accepted at polling places, and shifting ballot counting procedures to manual hand counts. Supporters of such measures argue they would strengthen election integrity. Critics say they could instead dramatically alter voting access. And that timing is crucial, because the midterm elections are only months away. Constitutional limits. Legal scholars across the political spectrum emphasize a basic point. The Constitution places responsibility for administering elections primarily with state legislatures and state governments. The president does not normally have authority to directly run elections. Even Congress has only limited powers to regulate certain federal election procedures. That is why the proposal, if attempted, would likely face immediate legal challenges. Courts would have to determine whether emergency powers could override constitutional provisions governing election administration. The historical context. The United States has faced disputes over election integrity before, but the system has always relied on decentralized administration. Each state conducts its own election process, sets its own procedures, and manages its own voting systems. That decentralized design was intentional. It was meant to prevent any single political figure from controlling the national election process. Changing that structure through an executive order would represent an unprecedented shift. Previous controversies. The debate around election administration did not begin with this draft order. Critics point to earlier controversies involving election claims. They also reference events surrounding the certification of the 2020 election results, when Trump urged Mike Pence to block the formal certification of electoral votes. Trump also contacted officials in several states, urging them to review or reconsider vote totals. Those events remain central to ongoing debates. Federal law enforcement concerns. Another controversial element is the possibility that federal law enforcement agencies could be involved in election oversight. Some commentators speculate that federal officers, including immigration enforcement personnel, might be deployed near polling locations. Supporters say this could help ensure election security. Opponents warn that it could intimidate voters and discourage participation. Currently, these ideas remain speculative. Congressional response. Members of Congress are already preparing potential responses should any such emergency declaration occur. One proposal reportedly drafted by Senator Alex Padilla would invoke provisions of the National Emergencies Act. That law allows Congress to vote on terminating a declaration. Under the act, any member of Congress can introduce a resolution ending an emergency. Such a resolution must receive floor consideration. However, the president retains the ability to veto that resolution, meaning Congress would need a two-thirds majority in both chambers to override it. The origins of the National Emergencies Act. The National Emergencies Act itself was passed in 1976. Its purpose was to limit and regulate growing emergency powers. Investigations at the time found that hundreds of emergency authorities had been granted since the administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Many remained active long after the crises passed. Lawmakers believed a formal process was needed to prevent future abuse of emergency powers. The political stakes. The debate is unfolding in a highly charged political environment. Midterm elections often serve as a referendum on the sitting president. Polls fluctuate constantly, but analysts say control of Congress could shift depending on voter turnout. If the president's party loses control of Congress, investigations and oversight hearings often follow. Historically, that shift in power has significantly constrained presidential agendas. Another aspect of the political battle involves redistricting. States periodically redraw congressional district boundaries. This process has long been controversial. It can allow political parties to shape districts in ways that favor their candidates. Several states have faced intense disputes over these maps. In some cases, voters have pushed back through ballot initiatives or court challenges. The larger democratic question. Ultimately, the deeper concern is about democratic institutions themselves. Historically, democratic systems rarely collapse through sudden coups. Instead, many scholars argue that democratic erosion often occurs gradually. Institutions are weakened step by step, often through legal mechanisms used in new ways. Changes accumulate slowly until the balance of power shifts significantly. If a president attempted to take direct control of elections through emergency powers, courts would almost certainly become involved immediately. Legal challenges would move rapidly. Eventually, the issue could reach the Supreme Court of the United States. The court would then have to determine whether such an action was constitutional. At its core, the issue comes down to a fundamental question: who ultimately controls the mechanisms of American elections? Is it the states, as the Constitution specifies? Or could emergency powers allow the federal executive branch to override that system under extraordinary circumstances? The answer could shape the future of American democracy. For now, the reported executive order remains only a draft. Officials associated with the administration have denied knowledge of the proposal. But the debate it has sparked reflects a deeper tension about presidential power, election integrity, and constitutional limits. Implementation would trigger a defining constitutional test.